In the vast reaches of the Horn of Africa, where the desert sands meet the endless blue of the Indian Ocean, a story older than memory begins. This is a land shaped by wind and water, by the slow patience of mountains and the relentless passage of time. Here, beneath the sun's harsh glare, life stirred long before names or kingdoms, long before history was recorded. The earliest people wandered these lands in search of sustenance, following the herds across savannas and highlands. Stone tools clinked against rocks, fire flickered against night skies, and the first seeds of human ingenuity were planted. Each riverbed, each cave, each dune became a repository of memory, a witness to survival, endurance, and adaptation. The Horn of Africa was not isolated. From its coasts, early Cushitic-speaking peoples looked beyond the horizon, toward Arabia and the lands across the sea. Trade, exploration, and curiosity were in their blood. Long before the rise of empires, the people of this land navigated rivers and coasts, carrying ivory, frankincense, and myrrh to distant markets, returning with foreign goods and knowledge. And then came the Egyptians, drawn southward by tales of wealth and mystery. They spoke of a land they called Punt, God's land, rich in gold, exotic woods, incense, and exotic animals. Their ships, carved from cedar and guided by skilled sailors, traced the Somali coast, bringing back treasures to temples and pharaohs. Punt was more than a trading partner. It was a place where commerce intertwined with culture, faith, and ritual. The Puntites, the ancestors of modern Somali peoples, were navigators of destiny. They knew the winds, the currents, and the stars. They transformed the coast into a hub of early civilization, where every harbor, every forest, every riverbank was a node in a network stretching across the Red Sea and into the wider world. As centuries passed, the Horn became a stage for growing complexity. Early settlements along the coast developed into city-states. Zaila, Berbera, Mogadishu, and Hafun emerged as centers of commerce and diplomacy. Here, merchants spoke multiple languages, exchanged coins, traded textiles, and shared knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and navigation. Somali sailors were among the first to harness the monsoon winds, venturing to Arabia, India, and beyond with dhows laden with goods and ambition. The land itself shaped these people as much as they shaped it. Nomadic clans moved with herds across plains and highlands, intimately knowing every well, every mountain pass, every seasonal river. Their society was woven from kinship, oral poetry, and memory, a tapestry of lineage and loyalty that would endure through millennia. With the arrival of Islam in the 7th century, the Somali coast entered a new era. Not brought by conquest, but by the gentle flow of trade and exchange, Islam blended with local traditions. Mosques rose beside bustling marketplaces. The call to prayer echoed over harbors. Cities became centers of scholarship, law, and spiritual devotion, their whitewashed minarets reflecting in turquoise waters. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Mogadishu stood as one of the most important ports in the Indian Ocean. Its coral stone buildings gleamed under the sun, its markets thrummed with life, and its people were celebrated across continents. Gold coins minted here traveled to Persia and India, textiles were prized far and wide, and Somali scholars exchanged knowledge with the farthest reaches of Asia. Trade was only one thread of the story. Clans and city-states developed governance, legal codes, and social structures. Poetry and oral history flourished as central pillars of identity. Through droughts, conflicts, and shifting alliances, the Somali people preserved their culture, navigating the challenges of survival while embracing the vast opportunities offered by the sea and desert alike. As the medieval era approached, the stage was set for the rise of more structured political entities. Coastal kingdoms, empowered by trade and fortified by faith, began to consolidate. The Horn was no longer merely a bridge between continents. It was a land of its own power, ambition, and innovation. As the first echoes of medieval times swept across the Horn, the coastline shimmered with ambition. The harbors of Zaila, Berbera, and Mogadishu grew into thriving city-states, each a jewel of trade and culture. Ships bristling with goods lined the docks. Sailors' voices mingled with the calls of merchants, the creak of ropes, and the rhythmic pounding of drums that marked the cadence of daily life. These were not mere ports, but gateways between continents, where African, Arabian, Persian, and Indian worlds converged. Inland, the landscape remained untamed, a mosaic of plains, mountains, and deserts. Nomadic clans moved with practiced precision, guiding their herds, tending wells, and navigating ancient trade routes that threaded through the interior. It was a land of contrasts, bustling markets at the coast, serene expanses of wilderness beyond, wealth and power flowing through cities, while traditions and kinship anchored life across the plains. By the 10th century, Somali city-states were sophisticated, organized, and interconnected. Governance rested on councils of elders and merchant guilds, blending the authority of lineage with the pragmatism of trade. Wealth and knowledge were celebrated equally. Coins, textiles, and spices traveled outward, while literature, poetry, and legal codes defined the social fabric. Education flourished in madrasas and mosques, where scholars studied the Quran alongside astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, ensuring that commerce and faith moved in harmony. From this foundation emerged the great sultanates that would define Somali medieval history. Among them, the Ajuran Sultanate rose as a power unparalleled in the Horn. Its influence spanned the southern coast, extending into the interior along the Shebel and Juba rivers. The Ajuran were master builders, engineers of hydraulic systems that channeled water across arid lands, irrigating fields and sustaining cities. Fortified towns and castles rose from the earth, symbols of organization, authority, and permanence in a land often defined by movement and migration. Trade under the Ajuran flourished. Somali merchants maintained networks stretching across the Indian Ocean. Zaila became a hub of exchange with Arabia, Persia, and India, while Mogadishu's influence extended as far as the Swahili coast. Gold, ivory, frankincense, and myrrh flowed outward. Silk, ceramics, and exotic goods returned. The Sultanate also acted as a stabilizing force in the interior, ensuring that clans and nomads could engage in commerce without constant conflict. To the north, the Adal Sultanate rose in prominence, a realm defined by resilience and military skill. It would later engage in epic struggles with neighboring Abyssinia, shaping the political and religious contours of the Horn for centuries. Adal's warriors were as skilled with words as with weapons, navigating diplomacy and faith alongside the strategy of the battlefield. Cities like Hara became centers of Islamic learning and art, their minarets and madrasas reflecting a culture where scholarship and devotion walked hand in hand. Meanwhile, the Efat Sultanate, earlier and to the northwest, had established trade links that predated the rise of Ajuran and Adal. Its cities served as conduits between the interior highlands and the coastal ports, enabling the flow of livestock, salt, and precious metals. Efat's legacy persisted in its emphasis on urban planning, fortification, and the integration of commerce with governance. These sultanates shared more than power, they shared vision. Islam provided a unifying framework, linking disparate clans and regions through faith, law, and cultural practice. Trade bound them to the wider world, fostering an openness to ideas, technologies, and innovation. And architecture, from coralstone mosques to fortified castles, embodied their permanence, monuments not only of power but of identity. Conflict and cooperation existed in tandem. Rivers and mountains defined spheres of influence. Nomadic groups negotiated alliances with urban elites. Battles were fought, but so were treaties and marriages, diplomacy as critical as strategy. The Horn was a complex tapestry, a dynamic equilibrium where commerce, faith, and politics intertwined. It was also a period of remarkable scholarship and cultural flowering. Libraries in Mogadishu, Hara, and Zaila held manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, and law, written in Arabic, Somali, and Swahili. Poets composed verses that chronicled the deeds of leaders and the virtues of clans, their words echoing across generations. The written and the oral intertwined, preserving a memory of society that celebrated both intellect and tradition. Beyond the borders of Somalia, the Horn's influence reached far. Somali merchants and scholars were sought after in Arabia, Persia, and India. Ships bearing Somali flags sailed the Indian Ocean, carrying goods, ideas, and culture. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Horn had become a hub of both material wealth and intellectual vitality, a region whose cities could rival the great ports of the wider world. Yet, even in times of prosperity, the currents of change were unstoppable. Portuguese explorers entered the Indian Ocean, seeking control over trade routes and challenging the dominance of local sultanates. The Horn became a chessboard in the wider struggle for influence, as European ambitions intersected with the ambitions of African and Arab powers. Despite these pressures, Somali sultanates adapted, negotiated, and persisted. The Ajuran continued to maintain hydraulic networks and urban centers. Adal fortified its northern and eastern strongholds. Coastal cities resisted incursions while maintaining their trade networks. Their resilience was a testament not merely to military skill, but to social cohesion, knowledge, and adaptability, a civilization capable of navigating both the sea and history itself. In this era, Somalia was not defined by conquest alone, nor by the arrival of foreign powers. It was defined by the intricate dance of society, commerce, faith, and geography, a civilization thriving at the edge of the known world, shaping and being shaped by currents of history far beyond its borders. The Horn's golden age of sultanates set the stage for the transformations to come. Foreign powers would arrive, colonial ambitions would press inward, and centuries-old patterns of life would face new trials. But the legacy of this age, of scholarship, commerce, and resilience, would endure, forming the backbone of Somali identity even as the tides of history shifted once again. As the 15th century drew to a close, the winds over the Indian Ocean shifted. New sails pierced the horizon, heavy, towering vessels unlike the slender dhows that had long danced across these waters. European ambition, fueled by the hunger for spices, gold, and control, entered the world of the Horn. And with it came a profound disturbance, a changing rhythm that would reshape centuries of equilibrium. The Portuguese were the first to arrive, driven by dreams of empire and the navigational prowess of explorers who traced the coasts of Africa with relentless determination. They sought mastery over the Indian Ocean trade, believing dominance over these waters would open the gates to wealth and influence unknown in Europe. Yet they found themselves navigating seas already commanded by seasoned Somali sailors and defended by sultanates whose power extended beyond the shoreline. The city-states of the Somali coast resisted fiercely. Mogadishu and Barawa stood proud against Portuguese bombardments, enduring destruction yet refusing surrender. Their people rebuilt walls and ports with the same resilience that had defined centuries of history. The conflict was not merely military, it was a clash of worlds, one shaped by centuries of African-Arabian trade and scholarship, the other driven by the momentum of a rising European age. In time, the Ottoman Empire, itself a vast and expanding power, lent support to the resistance against European encroachment. Ottoman and Somali forces cooperated in battles that rippled across the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, a partnership formed from shared faith and mutual strategic interests. Together, they disrupted Portuguese ambitions, keeping certain routes open and demonstrating that the Horn of Africa would not be easily subdued. Meanwhile, the Omani influence grew along the Swahili coast, weaving the Horn further into the intricate web of the Middle Eastern world. Trade networks deepened, connecting Somali merchants with ports stretching from Basra to Zanzibar. The cultural exchange enriched Somali cities, strengthening Islamic scholarship, maritime expertise, and commercial reach. The Horn remained dynamic, flexible, and engaged, a region accustomed to absorbing external influence without surrendering its identity. But change, once it begins, rarely stops at the borders of the sea. By the 19th century, the world was entering a new era of domination and conquest, the age of European imperial expansion. African shores, once admired for commerce, became targets for control. Europe's industrial engines demanded raw materials. Its empires demanded territory. And so began the slow tightening of external pressure that would test the Somali world more deeply than the distant cannons of earlier centuries. The scramble for Africa descended with alarming speed. Across the continent, lands were carved with straight lines drawn thousands of miles away, borders sketched by hands that knew nothing of the people whose lives they were dividing. In the Horn, this process unfolded with tragic precision. To the north, the British established themselves in what would become British Somaliland. Their presence began with treaties, forged under the pretext of protection, but soon grew into formal rule. They valued the territory for its location, a staging ground on the Gulf of Aden, and for the pastoral routes that supplied their empire with livestock. To the west and south, the Italians pushed in, driven by national ambitions of empire. What would become Italian Somaliland emerged through a combination of force, negotiation, and economic pressure. They built cities in their image, introduced administrative systems, and attempted to reshape the social fabric with the ambition of engineers charting a world they wished to command. To the northeast, the French secured their foothold in the small but strategic territory that would become Djibouti. Its port, positioned at the gates of the Red Sea, became a vital artery for French global influence. Somalia, once a single cultural and linguistic expanse united by trade and tradition, was now divided into three major colonial zones, each subject to the policies, interests, and ambitions of a different empire. And yet, beneath these new borders, clans and families continued their ancient migrations, ignoring the lines that attempted to confine them. Pastoral life persisted, moving with the seasons, bound more to the land and sky than to the flags planted in the earth. Colonial rule reshaped politics, economy, and daily life. Infrastructure was built, roads, railways, harbors, not for the prosperity of Somalis, but for the extraction of resources. Taxes were levied, forced labor imposed, and authority centralized. Traditional governance structures were weakened or manipulated, used as tools to maintain order rather than expressions of collective will. But just as foreign powers imposed order, they also inadvertently sowed the seeds of resistance. Somali society had always valued autonomy. Every clan, every lineage, every individual accustomed to governing their own life with dignity and honor. Colonial rule, rigid and external, clashed with these values. In the north, the dervish movement, led by Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, rose with fierce determination. It was a resistance rooted in faith, identity, and the refusal to submit. For over 2 decades, the dervishes fought relentlessly against British, Italian, and Ethiopian forces, creating one of the longest anti-colonial struggles in African history. Their story, though marked by sacrifice and loss, became a symbol, a testament to the enduring Somali spirit, to the belief that no foreign power could fully command a people shaped by centuries of independence. Across the colonial territories, resistance took many forms: armed uprisings, poetry that challenged oppression, community networks that preserved culture, and political movements that sought unity. The colonial powers, though formidable, could not extinguish the shared memory of a people with deep roots in history and identity. By the early 20th century, the world was shifting yet again. Global wars strained European empires. Nationalist movements surged across Africa and Asia. The idea of self-determination, dormant for generations, began to stir with new strength. Somalia, despite its divisions, began to imagine itself once more as a whole. Scholars, poets, merchants, and elders envisioned a future where the artificial borders of colonial maps would dissolve, where the ancient unity of language, culture, and history could re-emerge. The winds of change, once foreign, now arose from within. The dawn of independence was approaching, carried not by ships or cannons, but by the collective will of a people who had never forgotten who they were. As the mid-20th century unfolded, the old empires of Europe found themselves weakened by war, burdened by economic strain, and confronted by waves of rising nationalist movements across Africa and Asia. The world was changing with an irreversible momentum, and in the Horn of Africa, the Somali people felt the pulse of transformation in every marketplace, every town, every encampment beneath the open sky. For decades, they had lived within borders not of their making. Yet beneath the imposed divisions, the deep unity of language, culture, and shared memory endured. Somali identity had never been erased, only obscured by the structures of colonial rule. And now, as the winds of independence swept across the continent, that identity grew into a powerful force, a spark igniting across the north, the south, and the diaspora scattered through the ports of Arabia and the Indian Ocean. In British Somaliland, political organizations emerged, giving shape to the aspirations of a people long accustomed to governing themselves. In Italian Somaliland, social movements gained momentum, inspired by a new global conversation about rights, dignity, and self-determination. Across the colonial divides, Somalis began to envision the possibility of unity, that the fragments left by imperial borders could be restored into a nation shaped by its own will. The drumbeat of independence grew louder with each passing year. Elders debated under the shade of acacia trees, scholars drafted proposals, poets committed the hopes of the people to verse that traveled faster than any political manifesto. Young leaders, educated under colonial systems, turned the very knowledge they were given into tools of resistance, articulating a future beyond foreign rule. In 1960, the dream became reality. British Somaliland gained independence on June 26th. Only 5 days later, on July 1st, it united with Italian Somaliland to form the Somali Republic, a rare moment in African history where two previously colonized territories voluntarily merged to build a common nation. Across the new republic, celebrations erupted. Streets filled with music and prayer, flags rose above rooftops, speeches echoed with pride and possibility. A nation long divided by foreign lines had taken its first step toward reclaiming its own narrative. The early years of the Somali Republic were marked by optimism. New institutions emerged, guided by parliamentary democracy. Infrastructure expanded, literacy campaigns spread across towns and villages, and the capital, Mogadishu, transformed into a vibrant center of cultural and political life. On radio waves that crossed deserts and seas, Somali poetry, music, and debate carried the voice of a new era. Yet the unity forged in 1960 rested upon a fragile foundation. Clan allegiances remained strong, regional inequalities persisted, and the weight of decades under foreign rule lingered beneath the surface. Across the borderlands, Somali communities remained outside the Republic's borders, in Djibouti, in Ethiopia's Ogaden region, in northern Kenya, creating tensions that colonial maps had left unresolved. These realities, combined with Cold War pressures and internal political struggles, began to strain the young nation. The enthusiasm of independence gradually gave way to contention, disputes over power, elections, and representation. In 1969, amid escalating tensions, a military coup reshaped the Somali political landscape. The new era brought sweeping changes. Nationalism intensified. Efforts to unify Somali inhabited regions beyond the borders took on a new urgency, and the government accelerated campaigns of modernization, literacy, and public works. For a time, development surged. Roads cut across plains that had never before seen pavement. Schools reached towns once accessible only by caravan, and Mogadishu's skyline gleamed with new ambition. But the promise of this era was shadowed by increasing centralization of power and growing tensions with neighboring states. The Horn of Africa became a focal point in the Cold War, and Somalia found itself entangled in alliances that brought as many challenges as advantages. A devastating conflict in the late 1970s shifted the balance of power and unleashed cascades of hardship across the country. By the late 1980s, political fractures deepened. Regions felt marginalized, dissent grew, repression intensified. The fabric of national unity stretched thin, and then, under immense pressure, it tore. The collapse of central authority in 1991 opened one of the most difficult chapters in Somali history. Without a functioning state, conflict spread, fueled by competition for resources, political grievances, and shifting alliances. The once thriving capital became a battleground. The countryside fragmented under the weight of insecurity. Families were displaced, seeking refuge within and beyond Somalia's borders. Yet even in the darkest years, the resilience that had defined Somali identity for millennia did not fade. Communities rebuilt local governance systems rooted in customary law and clan agreements. Markets reopened, first in small outposts, then in cities. The port of Berbera revived. The streets of Hargeisa began to pulse with commerce. Mogadishu, despite turmoil, refused to be silenced. Throughout the country, women, elders, and local leaders became anchors of stability, weaving together systems of support when national institutions had vanished. The diaspora, spread from Nairobi to Minneapolis to Dubai, carried the country forward in new ways. They sent remittances that revived local economies, funded schools and clinics, and shaped global perceptions of Somalia through business, academia, and art. A nation fragmented at home found unity abroad, in memory, culture, language, and the unyielding desire for renewal. By the early 21st century, glimmers of recovery began to emerge. New political structures took root, federal states formed, peace conferences convened, and a gradual, uneven, but determined process of rebuilding began. International partners offered support, but the driving force remained Somali, shaped by the same autonomy, adaptability, and endurance that had guided the people through millennia. In cities rising anew, from Mogadishu to Bosaso to Baidoa, the energy of reconstruction mingled with the echoes of history. Markets hummed with commerce reminiscent of ancient trade routes. Young entrepreneurs launched ventures that connected the Horn to global networks. Scholars revived traditions of poetry and storytelling, linking the modern moment to a lineage stretching back to the time of Punt. Today, Somalia stands in a complex balance between struggle and hope, a nation still healing, still striving, yet undeniably alive. Its story is not a simple arc of rise and fall, but a long, winding journey shaped by resilience, identity, and the unbroken will of its people. For in the Horn of Africa, the land remembers, the sea remembers, and the people, scattered yet connected, battered yet unyielding, carry a memory older than empires, deeper than borders, and more enduring than any conflict. Somalia's history is not merely what happened. It is what survived. It is what continues. A story still being written, in the streets of Mogadishu, in the markets of Hargeisa, in the ports of Kismayo, in pastoral routes that cross ancient plains, in diaspora communities that span the world. A nation shaped by wind and water, by trade and scholarship, by hardship and hope, still moves forward, guided by the same horizon that once carried its ancestors across oceans. And as the sun rises over the Horn, casting light on a land both ancient and newly reborn, the journey of Somalia continues, a testament to endurance, identity, and the timeless human will to build, rebuild, and rise again.